Sorry, everyone, for the inconvenience. We were experiencing some technical issues, but we are ready to start our talk with Dr. Clarisa Lin Yasuda.
Okay, shall I resume?
Yes.
Okay, so let's resume here. So what I think it's important to remember, so we are talking about the both signal. So it measures the indirect effects of neuroactivity. It's not direct, it's indirect, because it depends on the changes of the oxygen levels in the blood. Okay, so remember we talked about the oxyhemoglobin and then the deoxyhemoglobin. So the changes occur because of the brain activation that change the level of oxygenated, the deoxygenated blood in that area. Okay, so now we go through the real results, what real matters for us. So what is task-related fMRI? I think it's a nice paper. So it is like exactly in our scenario. So it's neuroscience for neurologists. And it talks about the functional magnetic resonance imaging working for the clinical scenario. Okay, so I think it's a nice reference for you to have. So for those who are not used to fMRI, so you basically have the individual in the scanner. So all this setup here is built for, so you can have the visual stimuli here, and then you can also have some headphones that are compatible to the machine, and you can also have some like a joystick or other tool that allows you to give some answer for the stimuli you are receiving in the monitor. Okay, so this is just the basics. So what is the task-related fMRI? So as the name says, it's a task. So we have two basic paradigms. The most popular design is this one, the first one. It's named the block design paradigm. So it alternates periods of task with rest. Usually it takes like 20 seconds, and then it alternates for a couple of times. And then you will extract the both signal related to this activation, okay? So the second type of paradigm, which is a little bit different, is the event related. So different from the first one, you have the stimulus like this, and they are not very, here you see the difference. So here it's very 20 seconds, 20 seconds, 20 seconds, 20 seconds. Here it's different. So it's unpredictable. And that is what is important for the event-related paradigm. You have one stimulus here, then the subject cannot predict what time it will come again. Okay, and then you have a different curve for the both signal. Why is it important? So most of the experiments are based on block design. So imagine like here, you want to see the activation in the visual cortex. So a basic paradigm can alternate open eyes with closed. Okay, so you see the bold change here over time. And then if you subtract the activated areas from the areas when you are having the eyes closed, you get exactly the activation map, right? So how do we do that? There are many packages for processing. I will talk about this later a bit. So I will just give you here an example again. So you have this alternating period of rest and task. So here you see more or less the voxel here over time. The both signal is correlated with task. If you take a look in another voxel far from the region, it has no relationship with the task you presented to the subject. So there's a very low correlation. So this area, this voxel is not involved in this task. Okay, so this is how we will get the activation map. Again, so it's just another good example. So you see a very good correlation of the increases of the both signal with exactly with the task. right? So again, how do we do this? So there are several softwares. They are open source. You can use to process the images. So this is the SPM, Statistical Parametric Map. So this is from UCL. You have other from FSL, that's from Oxford. You have an American, that's Affini, and others. So here at Unicamp, we usually use the SPM that runs on a MATLAB platform. Okay. I will just outline very briefly, because I don't think it is the goal for us. So you have the subject in the scanner, you acquire the images, and then you have some steps. So some steps we call the pre-processing, and it based on the realignment, normalizing, and smoothing. Okay, so we have to take in account of the movements of the subject, because as we can see, sometimes the subject move the head a little bit, and then you have to account to that. Sometimes if the subject moves too much, it's not possible to use that image, okay? So there are a lot of technical issues when you are pre-processing the images, but I don't think it's the purpose of this webinar today, okay? So we imagine you have a subject, so we scanned it, it was a good imaging, we had the pre-processing, and now we go to the processing. What is this step? So we have the first level, or the individual. So we have the pre-processing, and then we now want to calculate the individual maps activation based on the timing of the stimuli and the rest. Remember, we have to separate, and then we will extract the both signal from the periods of stimuli from the rest periods. So there are some issues that we have to take into account. So if you are talking about an individual map of activation, for instance, for a surgical planning, you want the activation map to be exactly related to the subject structural imaging, okay? So in this case, you will preserve all the analysis in the subject's native space, okay? So when you're thinking about only a subject individual activation map, you will not need to normalize the image. What is it important, this step? So when you are thinking about group analysis, then imagine you have to be sure that all the people are aligned. So that's when enters the step of normalization, okay? So you have to be sure, for instance, all the precentral gyros of all the subjects are aligned, okay? So then you have to normalize all the individual scans. So you have the first level, then you have the second level. So second level is important when you are thinking about group analysis like this. So imagine you want to compare a group of controls with a group of patients with some task, and then we need to be sure the images are really well aligned. And we can use some, like the software SPM, to calculate the difference, okay? So this, I think we can go now to the clinical application. And I want to start talking about surgery, okay? So again, so this is another paper that focused on the clinical applications and future direction of functional fMRI. I think this is one of the very typical application of fMRI. So imagine you have a subject with a tumor in an eloquent area like here, and you are interested to know whether or not the activation of the motor cortex is related to this lesion, right? And why is it important? Because fMRI can give you the map of activation, and then, for instance, you can apply a motor fMRI, like here. In Campinas, we use this block design paradigm with visual stimuli. So you will show a hand to the subject, and he instructed to hand tapping. So it alternates period of 20 seconds of task, hand tapping, and then 20 seconds of rest. And with that, we are able to map the motor cortex. And it's now we can overlay the activation map on top of the structural image. And we can see the relationship between the activation map and your lesion. It is nice because the surgeon can plan ahead, can consider the implications of the surgery and talk with the patient, right? And if you are interested in visual fMRI, I showed you a simple example of eyes closed and eyes open, but you can have very strong stimuli like this, okay? And you will get a very strong activation of your occipital area. What else can we do with that? So if you are talking about surgery, you can take your activation map to the operating room and use in combination with your neuronavigator, okay? And then it helps the surgeon. You can get your structural image and put on top the co-register, the activation map, and then use this during the surgery. So this is one example of a clinical application. So in summary, we can use fMRI in brain tumor surgery. There are some uses, there are some limitations, of course. It is nice because it can be available preoperatively, as I said, and helps the decision by surgeon and patient. It's non-invasive and can be repeatable. It's nice. It's very nice to demonstrate motor areas better than the language areas. Okay, so motor has been very popular, but language is a bit more complicated, and we'll see some examples of language in ahead. So the second application that I think it's nice to talk, of course, is about epilepsy. Again, that same article, they also mention about the use of the fMRI in epilepsy. So it helps to determine the lateralization of language dominance, predicting the risk of language function decline after surgery. It also is an adjunct to direct cortical stimulation for mapping relationship of lesion to language, motor, somatosensory areas. It can also predict the memory depth following anterior temporal lobectomy. And as you said, as you all already saw in the Dr. Gottman's webinar, you can use with fMRI EEG and help to localize lesions, right? So here is one example that from our university, in which we had a patient with a suspicious lesion of a cortical dysplasia in the motor region. And we want to see whether or not the relationship between the lesion and the motor activation. So we performed right hand fMRI, and then we got the activation map, and we overlaid this on top of the individual structural image. So you can see the activation here and the contralateral cerebellar activation as well. Okay, so this is motor activation is very strong. It is very straightforward to perform in fMRI. So now I will talk a bit about language, okay, and fMRI. So here is another example of ours. So we had a patient with another suspicion of focal cortical dysplasia in the left temporal lobe, and we want to know whether or not the language area was related to the lesion. And for our surprise, it was nice to see the subject had bilateral activation of the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so we here at the Unicamp, we have been using both motor and then language fMRI for our patients when we have to decide for surgery, especially in those with more complicated situations. We have been used, it's our routine to perform fMRI. And as I told you, it's a recent paper. So the language fMRI can also be used to predict name changing after adult temporal lobe epilepsy surgery. Okay, so in this study, they observed that the resection of fMRI activation, the map of activation performed during our definition decision task, is an important factor for postoperative change in naming ability, along with other predictors. Okay, so it's an example of how language fMRI can be used not only to visualize the location, but also to predict verbal decline after surgery, right? What else can we do with this fMRI? So another field of interest, I think it is very clinical, is to use fMRI for pharmaco studies, right? So we can see the effects of some drugs in the brain. So this is one study that I performed during my postdoc at UCL. So we all know all about the topiramate effect on language, right? And so we try to see what happens with the brain when you are taking topiramate. So here we have the normal subjects. You have language activation, normal language activation. We have patients taking other drugs with a smaller activation, and patients taking topiramate. Okay, so we have a very small activation. But the interesting part is that in the normal controls, when you activate an area of language, you have to deactivate this blue here, this area. Okay, so in order to engage in a task, you have to activate a network and deactivate another network. Okay, so when you are taking topiramate, you are not able to deactivate this network like this. So there's an impairment of deactivating the default mode network, right? So this is what we saw. So this is a review from Nature, which explains. So whenever you have an activated task, you have to deactivate the default mode network, right? So when you activate something, you have to deactivate another network as well. And then we perform some individual studies in a longitudinal way. So we have the same subjects on and off topiramate. And we observed that when the subject was taking topiramate, they were not able to deactivate it properly. Okay, so the red are the activation when they are taking topiramate, and then the blue is when they are not taking topiramate, and then you see the normal deactivation pattern. Yeah. And then some people said, but then there's interaction between the topiramate and the surgery and the epilepsy, and we cannot disentangle. So what we did, so we recruited some patients with headache. They were not having seizures, right? Only headache. They were taking topiramate for treating migraine. And then we had the language evaluation, and for our surprise, those patients taking topiramate, they also performed very badly. And comparable to the patients with TLE. And then when we look at the activation, so these are the controls, and then the people taking topiramate for headache, they have a very bad activation. And also those with TLE. And then when we look at the deactivation pattern, so these are the normal deactivation, and those with headache taking topiramate, they also could not to deactivate properly. So here we showed an effect of topiramate. And also the same group from Matthias, they also studied levetiracetam and showed that levetiracetam kind of normalize the network activations in TLE. So that's why probably levetiracetam is also considered a very good drug to be taken and with less cognitive effects. Okay, and I will talk a bit about the memory fMRI, which is very important, especially in temporal lobe epilepsy. Okay, and there are several studies in TLE related to memory fMRI, explaining all types of deficits, okay? But as a clinical application, I think it's one very important paper is this one wrote by Manuela, in which they showed how the memory fMRI can predict vertebral memory decline after surgery, right? And it's important because those patients that showed activation in the left temporal lobe and the left frontal and anterior medial temporal activation, they presented greater vertebral memory decline. While those who presented bilateral posterior hippocampal activation, they had less vertebral memory decline. This is especially in left TLE, but not in right TLE. So only for those with left hippocampal sclerosis. So this is, I will just talk a little bit about the paradigm. So they have to, the subject is challenged with a memory encode paradigm. So the subject sees in the scanner 100 images of words while he's inside the scanner. And he's instructed to memorize the items because later they will recall and test again, okay? So after scanning, the subjects, they are shown the same 100 words mixed with 50 novel words in a recognition task. So it's like this. So when it's inside the scanner, it sees in the monitor pictures or words. In that case, it's verbal, it's some words. And then after the scanner is finished, outside, it sees all the words with some new, and then it has to recognize the old pictures and words that has been shown inside the scanner. That's how you can account and to know how many and which type of word it has been really encoded inside the scanner. So in that study, so this is the memory encode activations in controls in the left TLE and then the right TLE. So this is only the activation patterns. And what they realized so they realized that the patients which had the predominant left medial temporal lobe activations here, and then it had the surgery, they present a greater postoperative verbal memory decline. But this happened in LTLE, but for the right TLE patients, they didn't observe the same correlation. So here, just to see that those 7 out of 8 patients that experienced verbal memory decline, they have most of the activation for the verbal memory paradigm in the dominant hemisphere. Okay, so this is we can calculate the lateralization index of the activation map, and then this is how we can quantify this. And very recently, the American Academy of Neurology, they recommended to use memory fMRI to predict the verbal memory decline. And so because of that, Manuela and Sarah, they published recently a guide to design a memory fMRI paradigm for this pre-surgical evaluation. So if you are interested, you can see the details here. And just to remind, so in this case, for memory analysis, they usually use not the block design that we use for language or for motor, but it is more the event-related analysis that can really examine the memory formation, just a technical note. But then when we talk about clinical applications, we have to think about not only about epilepsy, that has been used for Alzheimer's disease and traumatic brain injury. You can also have some studies, and also in several psychiatric diseases. So fMRI has been used a lot, not only in epilepsy or surgery, but also to help understanding and also more to classify or as a biomarker for all other diseases as well. Okay. So this last bit, I won't talk about the resting state. Okay, I think it is very popular, and I want to talk a little bit about the resting state and some clinical application as well. So different from the task-related fMRI, the resting state, of course, it's acquired in rest, so the subject does not need to do anything. So it is less demanding and can be performed on subject and patients who may not otherwise be able to cooperate with task-based paradigms, such as young children, those with altered mental status or sedated, or who are paratic or aphasic, right? So it's an alternative. And what is all based? So it bases on functional connectivity, which is related to the temporal correlations between the remote neurophysiological events. And we search for synchronized low-frequency fluctuation of the both signals during the rest. So we will see what are the regions that are somehow correlated or connected. So again, we will examine what's happening with the both signal over time in different regions of the brain. So imagine you have the time over here, and then you are extracting the both signal in the left motor area, in the right motor region during rest. So the subject is laying down, eyes closed, but not sleeping. Even during the rest, the both signal from the two regions, they are very well correlated. So it gives you a Pearson correlation index of 0.84. If you compare the both signal from the left motor region with the left visual area, they are not related. So the correlation is 0.06, so they are not connected, right? So this is what we call a synchronized regions. So here you have the basis of the functional connectivity analysis, because even during the rest, there are some regions that are synchronized. And so this picture I have already shown. So there are some areas, like this is the most important or the most famous, this is the default mode network. So this is the default, it is active during the rest, okay? And this has been the most studied network ever. And how do we study this functional connectivity map? So you have the subject, you acquire the image, the subject was laying down and just resting. And you, for example, you want to see what is correlated with the left motor region, okay? So for that, you will define a region of interest, we call a seed. You will extract the both signal, we call this the time series, from that region. And then you will use the software to find in the rest of the brain the regions that have fluctuated with the same pattern as the left region, as from where you extracted the region. And you see it, so you have the left supplementary motor cortex, and then you find that the right contralateral area is very correlated, even though the subject is not performing any task. And this can be very useful, for instance. So this is another interesting article that shows a role of the resting state for clinical application as well. And here we can see, I will show you an example of this application, okay? So this is task-free pre-surgical mapping using resting state. So in this study, they had a patient with epilepsy and a lesion in this area, okay? So they compared, so the subject performed the motor task, and they also acquired resting state fMRI and performed functional connectivity analysis, similar to that example I gave you. And when they overlapped the two maps, they saw they have a very nice It's quite coincident, okay? And so they performed this for the hand and the tongue. They were very interested in to see how the overlap was. What they realized is that in the task-based here, apparently, the activation of the hand is very intense here. And there is no indication of deficit in the hand motor area. However, if you look at the functional connectivity map of the motor cortex, it shows difference between the two sides, suggesting a deficit in this area where is the lesion hemisphere, but not for the tongue. So for the tongue, both task and task-free analysis, they were very similar, okay? So it was interesting that for the functional connectivity without task, it showed a deficit of activation in the area. And this is a very nice study because they had the surgery and they observed that they had the electrodes here, and then when they stimulated these two, they have problems with hands, and then with the other ears, they have problems with the tongue movements. And so here we can see that the green circles show the locations of cortical stimulations that selectively disrupted hand and tongue movements. And it is very nice to see that the hand and tongue regions defined by the functional connectivity correlate with the estimates of the regions based on the stimulation. So the functional connectivity map showed the deficit very similar to the pattern observed when you stimulated the electrodes on top of the cortex during the surgery. So it's another example of application of the resting state and in a clinical setting. Okay, but different from the task-related fMRI, the resting state is not very popular. So this is a recent article and show that very few people use resting state fMRI in clinical practice. And so there are some efforts to stimulate people to use more and more the resting state in clinical situations. Okay. And so when you think, I want to just to stimulate you, because I know that some of you may be interested in some research, and there are many applications of fMRI, and to remind you of some of them, you have potential clinical applications in the immediate future. So you can use fMRI to develop disease biomarkers, to understand a lot of disorders. It can be used to track the biofeedback. It can give you some regions for neuromodulation. You can use it to assess locked-in patients. You can use to assess the blood oxygenation and track the brain metabolism and neurovascular coupling. So there are other type of contrast, not only the body, the arterial spin labeling, and can provide you some information about perfusion as well. And for us, because we are most interested in fMRI and epilepsy, so it can also be used to help to localize the seizure foci. And it's being widely used in a basic neuroscience. So for those interested, these are the guidelines. So the use of MRI in pre-surgical evaluation of patients with epilepsy. And here is the link. And it is mostly recommended for tracking the verbal memory decline, because for the other modalities, like for language, and then there are weak evidence. But for memory decline, it has been recommended as a good tool to be used. And so if you want some technical information about processing the images, I give you the contact of our physicist in my lab. That's Bruno, who helped me with some slides. And Bruno himself developed a software to be used with SPM and MATLAB that makes much easier life to process this fMRI for both task-related and the resting state. So he's a very nice guy, and he developed some tools to make our life easier to process the images. So thanks for your attention. So this is our campus, and this is part of my group in the lab.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Yasuda, for your very, very interesting talk and very practical talk. I really enjoyed it. There's a question regarding how much approximately does it cost to do a pre-surgical evaluation of with using fMRI?
You mean well, in the
We are evaluating
private in the private sector, it costs a lot. I know. Between $500, $1,000, or maybe more. But I think in most of university hospitals, it is for us it is routine, but it is not cheap. Especially if you want to integrate DTI and tractography, it can cost a lot of money. But it is being performed in some private hospitals, even in Brazil. We have some hospitals that are performing.
Another question, is there any applicability for psychiatric disorders in epilepsy of fMRI? Has it been used to evaluate these disorders in patients with epilepsy?
Well, there are several studies that has been, not several, there are some studies that combine fMRI to evaluate some psychiatric symptoms in epilepsy. We have one study of resting state analyzing anxiety in generalized epilepsy. We see a disruption of functional connectivity in those patients with generalized epilepsy and with anxiety and depression. So you can use fMRI, and especially like resting state, to map some deficits. In psychiatry, there are many studies that use fMRI, even task-related paradigms. You can task inhibition, disinhibition with a lot of different paradigms in different psychiatric conditions. It's being widely used.
Very interesting. Well, I want to say thank you all for joining us in this webinar. If you have any more questions, please don't forget to write them down on our comment box. And please remember to fill today's evaluation. Next topic, 1 week from now, will be brain stimulation for the treatment of epilepsy by Antonio Valentin from UK. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay. I hope thank you so much, Dr. Yasuda, for your help. It was a very interesting talk, actually. It was very practical. I really liked it.
It was very basic.
No, but that's what I like, that you explained each of these things, like the tasks, what do you have to do, how do you do them, how do you post-process everything, because for example, I have very little knowledge regarding fMRI, so it's good to start from the practical aspects of it, and the recommendations of the studies are very, very good, of things that we can read.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, good to know you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.